Hello guys, and welcome back to our channel. Now today we're going to take a look at a topic that's often met with defensiveness and denial, the concept of palm color culture. Does palm color culture even exist? Now, for a long time, discussions around culture have been centered around Black and communities of color, with many palm color people feeling left out or offended. However, as one brave palm color woman points out in this video, the reason they can't seem to pinpoint a distinct palm color culture is because historically, palm color people have been the oppressors, not the oppressed. Now, as she puts it, palm color people are a race that has taken and oppressed other cultures, trying to eradicate them in the process. And yet, despite centuries of violence and marginalization, the cultures of African and Native American communities have endured. They've maintained their traditions, their art, their music, and their identities. Perhaps now that a palm color person has dared to speak this truth, other palm color people can begin to understand this and come out from their illusion of saying they have a culture. Maybe it's time for palm color people to acknowledge that their culture is not superior, but rather it's a product of the cultures they've oppressed and exploited. So with that said, let's take a look at these videos. I will be right back.
All right, white culture real quick. There can't be white culture in this country, period. There's no white culture. And I think that offends white people because we are always talking about Black culture and Native culture. And then we get mad. We're like, well, we're a culture. No, we're a race. We're a race that took two other cultures, an entire African culture and an entire Native culture, and we oppressed one and we tried to eradicate the other. But throughout all of our oppression and our they never their culture never they kept their religious practice, they kept their art, their fashion, their food, their music. No matter what we tried to do to the African culture that we brought here and the Native culture that we stole from, they never died. And that drives white people crazy. So now we're desperate to have our own culture because we can't keep stealing from the ones that we've oppressed.
So to me, white culture is industrialism, cultivation, intelligence, cleanliness, order, generosity, and so much more.
Hello, my friend. I completely disagree with this notion that there is a white culture. The idea that there is a set culture that all people of a specific skin tone or racial categorization adhere to. Now, people that we consider white, people of Europe and much of the Western world, do have their own cultures, but to say all of those cultures are the same just doesn't make much sense to me. Before I continue, I wanted to get to another part of this video.
And I think the same can be said of other ethnicities, because with brown culture, red culture, yellow culture, Black culture, as well as white culture, we need a foundation that builds into all.
As a South Asian, I also don't agree with the notion that there is a brown culture. There are various cultures within South Asia that are quite distinct and often quite different to each other. I also don't understand the idea that there is a yellow culture. That itself sounds like a problematic term. For example, a person from Mongolia likely has more cultural similarities to someone in Kazakhstan than they do to someone who lives in Indonesia or Southeast Asia. The idea that all these groups are a single culture because they look the same makes no sense. I think where this argument stems from is the existence of Black culture. The concept of a Black culture doesn't imply that all people that share an African phenotype share a single culture. It more so represents the Black identity which exists in America. The Black identity in America isn't just a racial idea, it now represents an ethnic group, right? And that ethnicity, like other ethnicities, has its own culture which is distinct from other people that exist in Africa or other parts of the world that we may consider Black. Now, if you're a white person in America, you definitely still have a culture. It's just that that culture is not exclusive to you based on your appearance. Unless perhaps you identify with a diasporic community. What confuses me the most is that the European world is so culturally diverse. Why would you want to paint over that with a single brush? Also, before I end this, the things you attributed to your idea of a white culture are in no way exclusive to the communities that identify with that racial identity.
White people did not factually develop more culture and technology. Almost all of white culture in the modern day is derivative of Black culture, first of all. Literally all of your music. The vast majority of your other fashion and pop culture is derivative of either Latino or Black culture. And if you're talking about European white history, I mean, it depends on what culture you're talking about, because Greeks and Romans arguably weren't white in the way that you would think of white people, because Greek and Roman civilizations were fairly multicultural, all things considered. So what, you're talking about like Shakespeare and the King James Bible? You talk about technology and inventions, a lot of them came from the East, or otherwise developed at some point in time by an indigenous culture elsewhere, usually to a more proficient degree than the Anglo-Saxons did. Like hell, even the moon landing was calculated by black women. And because a lot of white supremacy is also tied in with misogyny, why don't we take a look at the history of computers, where the parents of computing, Ada Lovelace and Alan Turing, were a woman and... Like hell, white people use the Arabic numeral system. And so any superiority that you think that white people have in terms of culture or technology, it's because they are standing on the shoulders of giants from other cultures.
We need to stop saying that white people don't have culture, because it actually helps white supremacy.
So white culture exists, but it is not a culture as such. It's a power structure, an ideology. It's white supremacy, the will to power, the desire to be the universal subject, to be default, neutral, to be considered merely human without having to hyphenate or qualify. Now, the problem is, occupying that neutral default position doesn't really lend itself to the sorts of idiosyncrasies and particularities that we associate with culture. Not only that, it leads you to the denial of that sort of specificity. Think of the way that transphobes like to claim that they don't have pronouns. Now, of course, white people have cultures. They have regional, national, linguistic communities that they belong to. But that is very different from saying that they have a white culture. And in fact, those individual cultures do a lot of work to undermine the idea of white culture and white supremacy. Because if you call yourself, for instance, an Irish American, you're weakening your claim to being only American. You've now joined the long list of people with hyphenated identities. And I would add one last point, something else that is missing from that general category of white culture, which is a claim to injury. So the sociologist Wendy Brown, in her book States of Injury, describes how identity categories tend to be formed in response to some sort of harm. A group of people is oppressed, they form a community in response, and then name themselves. And that series of acts, is the formation of a culture. But white culture has never had that experience. We share no common experience of oppression or victimization because of our race, which goes a long way to explaining why it is that we say something provocative like white culture doesn't exist, because it is a very different animal.
Now, the woman's statement is a reminder of the complex and problematic history of palm color culture. As she notes, palm color people have historically been the oppressors, not the oppressed, and this has resulted in the erasure and marginalization of Black culture and cultures of color, as well as the appropriation and exploitation of our traditions and practices. Now, one need look no further than the history of colonialism and slavery to see the devastating impact of palm color supremacy on cultures of color. The transatlantic slave trade, for example, forcibly brought millions of Africans to the Americas, where they were subjected to brutal treatment and forced to abandon their cultural practices. Similarly, the colonization of Native American communities resulted in the loss of land, culture, and identity. Now, despite this history of oppression, Black cultures and cultures of color have managed to survive and even thrive. Black American culture, for example, has had a profound impact on American music, art, and literature. And similarly, Native American communities have maintained their cultural traditions and continue to fight for their rights and sovereignty. While culture has often been characterized by its attempts to erase and appropriate cultures of color, from the minstrel shows of the 19th century to the cultural appropriation of today, palm color culture has consistently demonstrated a lack of respect and understanding of cultures of color. Now, the woman's statement is really a powerful call to action, urging palm color people to confront their own privilege and complicity in the oppression of Black culture and cultures of color. As she notes, palm color people must acknowledge that their culture is not superior, but rather it's a product of the cultures they've oppressed and exploited. The influence of Black American culture on what is commonly referred to as palm color culture is profound and far-reaching. From music and art to fashion and language, Black American culture has been a driving force in shaping the cultural landscape of America. Let's take music, for example. which is an area where Black American culture has had a lasting impact. We're talking about jazz, blues, and hip-hop, which originated in Black communities, which have become integral parts of American music. Now, many palm color artists have borrowed from and built upon those genres, often without proper credit or compensation. Fashion is another area where Black American culture has had a significant influence. From the zoot suits of the 1940s to the hip-hop inspired streetwear of today, Black American fashion has been a driving force in shaping American style. Language is also an area where Black American cultures had a lasting impact. African American Vernacular English, the AAVE, has influenced the way many Americans speak, with phrases and words such as yo, finna, and low-key becoming increasingly mainstream. Now, Black American culture has also had a significant impact on American art and literature. The Harlem Renaissance, for example, was a cultural and intellectual movement that saw an explosion of Black artistic and literary talent. This movement had a lasting impact on American art and literature, influencing generations of writers and artists. Now, the influence of Black American culture on what is commonly referred to as palm color culture is undeniable. I wholeheartedly agree with the Palm Color Ladies' assertion that there is no distinct palm color culture. Her statement is a refreshing dose of honesty in a society where palm color culture is often presented as the default or the norm. Now, the ladies' point that palm color people often get offended when they are told there is no palm color culture is well taken. This offense stems from the fact that palm color people are accustomed to being the center of attention, with their culture and experiences being the standard against which all others are measured. Now, the constant discussion of Black culture and Native culture, on the other hand, is a testament to the rich and diverse heritage of these communities. And these cultures have been shaped by unique histories, traditions, and experiences that are distinct from those of palm color people. Palm color culture is often characterized by its lack of distinctiveness, its tendency to appropriate and erase the cultures of others, and its role as the dominant culture in many societies. This is not to say that palm color people don't have their own traditions, customs, and experiences, but rather that these are often deeply intertwined with the cultures of others. Now, the phenomenon of palm color people claiming to have factually developed culture and technology is a pervasive one. Normally, it's a tendency that stems from a deep-seated desire to be seen as innovators, pioneers, and trailblazers. Now, throughout history, palm color people have consistently sought to erase the contributions of Black and people of color and claim credit for their achievements. And this is evident in the way that ancient civilizations such as Egypt, Greece, and Rome are often presented as being exclusively palm color, despite the fact that these cultures were heavily influenced by, interacted with Black and people of color. Similarly, the contributions of people of color to modern science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields are often overlooked or downplayed. The likes of Madam C.J. Walker, Granville Woods, and Mary Tickle, who made significant contributions to their respective fields, are often relegated to the footnotes of history. Meanwhile, palm color people are often hailed as innovators and pioneers, even when their contributions are built on the backs of others. We have finally come to the end of the video, but what do you, our viewers, have to say? Share your thoughts, your views in the comment section. Thank you for always watching, and see you in our next video as we bring you another interesting video.